Welcome to NABA Perspectives, where we look at key issues, stories, and themes that are driving economy, policy, and business across Africa. I'm Macky Sall, the head of content at the Norwegian-African Business Association, or NABA, and this week we're talking about Senegal. Our guest to talk about recent events in Senegal, the political crisis that has been triggered by President Macky Sall's decision to delay the election, is Martin Roberts, who is principal analyst and deputy head for sub-Saharan African country risk at S&P Global Market Intelligence. We talk about the origins of this crisis. We talk about where we are in this crisis and where we might be going, and overall why Senegal might be looking at a complicated and potentially bumpy road ahead. Martin, welcome to NABA Perspectives. Real pleasure to have you on. Thanks for making the time.
Thank you, Larry. It's nice to be here.
All right, before we get into the conversations, a lot to cover. Anyone who's been following the news around Africa will know that this month has been all about Senegal and the crisis that's been triggered there. But before we dig into that, Martin, could you just maybe give us a quick intro, a little bit about S&P Global and what your area of focus, your area of expertise is?
Sure. Yes, I'm Martin Roberts. I'm an associate director with the country risk department of S&P Global. So we're looking at all sorts of risks, basically apart from economics. We have counterparts for that. The countries I cover are mostly coastal West Africa. I've been covering Senegal since 2011. So right. Even before Macky Sall was president.
Right. Okay. So you've seen a few things in that time then, and sounds like I'm speaking to exactly the right person, because risk is a theme or mood that has certainly surrounded Senegal over the last month. Now, to begin with, a lot has happened, but it makes sense to me to do a bit of a stock take and get a better understanding of exactly what's happened in Senegal, how we got there, and what some of the key dynamics are to understand. Now, that's a big question. So to help you narrow that down, what I'll do is just give you my very basic understanding of the situation, and then maybe you can fill in some of the blanks and some of the important dynamics that people really need to understand. So here's my understanding. On February 3rd, Macky Sall, the president of Senegal, declares that the presidential election, which was supposed to take place on the 25th, is going to be postponed. My understanding is he put that down to irregularities or concerns around how presidential candidates were selected. And there's been all sorts of discussion about, one, whether or not that was within his remit as president. But of course, the fallout has been all sorts of quite shocking and surprising events in Senegal, a country that's known for its democratic credentials, where we've seen lots of protests, we've seen international concerns around this. We have seen a standoff between Macky Sall and the courts around whether or not the election can be postponed, to when it will be postponed. You know, there was talk about it happening in December. There was a bill passed on the 5th, which formalized the decision to postpone the bill. That's my basic sense. There have been protests since then, a lot of internal opposition within Senegal, obviously a lot of raised eyebrows outside of Senegal. What am I missing? Give us a bit of a stock take.
Well, it was certainly a left field development, but I think if you look back at the political career of Macky Sall, it sort of makes sense. He claimed that the disqualification of candidates by the Constitutional Council amounted to an institutional crisis that allowed him to intervene as president. But this was very much a sort of personal interpretation, and obviously the validity of that has been questioned, because the Constitutional Council ruled on the 15th that this was inadmissible and we should move ahead to an election. Macky Sall seems to have accepted that principle, and he's accepted that he should stand down as president on April the 2nd, which he admitted in a televised interview last Thursday. But probably going to be a lot more to happen, before then. And I think if you look back at his career, this decision to postpone the election, which let's remember only took place hours before campaigning was due to start, it only makes some sort of sense, or is at least comprehensible, if you consider the ways in which he's already abused his power as Senegalese president. We had corruption cases against Karim Wad, son of the former president, who is again a key figure in this latest development, but also against the former Dakar Mayor Khalifa Sall. They were ruled out of competing in the 2019 election. Now, coincidentally, these corruption cases just happened to have been brought against the probable two strongest challengers to Macky Sall in that poll when he was going for a second term. And if anyone doubted these cases were politically motivated, then they only have to look at the legal troubles that have enveloped Usman Sonko since he became the rising star of the opposition because he finished third in that poll. Now, Sonko is not only jailed now, but his PASTEF party was dissolved at the end of July for allegedly inciting insurrection. And those related riots around the middle of last year were linked to the belief that Sall wanted to sideline Sonko because he wished to stand for a third term. Now, although he did eventually confirm he wouldn't stand again, he knowingly allowed a situation of extreme protest to develop in which at least 19 people died. He also claimed he could have stood again if he wanted to, despite having been absolutely crystal clear when the constitution was changed in 2016 to bring presidential term limits back down to 5 years, that he would not use this as a pretext to reset term limits. He obviously hoped people had forgotten about that. But here's the dichotomy. The extraordinary thing is that I think these dictatorial acts and tendencies are in stark contrast to Sall's track record. Senegal's enjoyed unprecedented levels of growth under him thanks to the success of the emerging Senegal plan, and that's even before oil and gas production starts to make a real difference. All he's really achieved is to deepen his unpopularity and to harm the chances of his BBY coalition staying in power. So I think it's this, and the apparent belief that the rules don't really apply to him, that explains his extraordinary last-minute decision. We also have to look at what's the motivation for this. Why did he postpone at the last minute? And I think it's clear that it was a dawning realization that his hand-picked candidate, Prime Minister Amadou Ba, was going to lose. Why should that happen? Why should that really matter to Sall? Well, I think it does matter for reasons that are largely sort of unmentioned at the moment, which is that given his dictatorial tendencies towards his opponents in the past, his pursuit of them through legal cases, in particular corruption cases, he feared that if his party was out of power, the boot was going to be on the other foot. And essentially, he was going to be tied up for many years in his own legal cases and will probably have problems going back to Senegal.
Right, so this, I mean, you've touched on what to me is just the key question here is, why did Sall make this decision? And I mean, he is the central figure in this in many ways. And there has been so much speculation that he wants to make himself a president for life. He has no desire to leave. Now, we know in July of last year, after long delays and lots of speculation, he finally said, I'm not going to seek a third term. Now he has, following a decision by the Constitutional Court that basically declares his postponement illegal, he said, I will leave on April 4th. So if it's not a power play for him, it's a power play for his ruling party. Got to be.
It's only a power play in the sense that I think he's playing for time. I think he's backed himself into a corner now. And although in the past he's been able to rely on the security forces to repress protest, see, this is the corollary of Senegal not being a country that's ever experienced a coup, is that the security forces are always willing to do the bidding of the president. And when that bidding sort of veers into sort of slightly dictatorial tendencies, if they're still prepared to carry it out, it's a worrying situation. But I think he's now realised that the situation has turned against him, in that he doesn't really have any more excuses to cling on to power. He has now fairly openly admitted he's got to stand down on April the 2nd, so it's very hard to sort of withdraw from that position. I think he was a bit panicked because he'd realised that not only Ba would lose, but perhaps this only really makes sense if he had expected that Karim Wad would be allowed to stand in the election. So this is the so-called reason why, I mean, he's the main candidate at issue here that the Constitutional Council ruled out. They say that he was ruled out on justifiable grounds in that he hadn't renounced his dual French nationality in time. There are all sorts of debates and rumours swirling around about that, but the fact remained that he didn't actually renounce it until the middle of January. Why he waited so long is anyone's guess. And it seems to be at least a probable line of inquiry that Karim Wadi's been in exile in Qatar since 2016, when he was at the point at which he was released from his jail sentence for corruption, wanted to return to Senegal, and some sort of deal had been struck with Macky Sall and with BBY that he would transfer the support from his Senegalese Democratic Party in the second round to Amadou Ba, who presumably thought he would be in the runoff at least.
So what does this tell us about the state of democracy in Senegal? This has been a theme that's been very heavy in the coverage of this. There's been all sorts of warnings about how democracy is in peril in Senegal. It's another blow to democracy in West Africa, global democratic backsliding. Now, clearly, what's happened is not conducive to, the ordinary day-to-day functioning of democratic institutions. But it sounds to me, from what you're saying and Sall's presidency, that this isn't. That what we're seeing here isn't some out of the blue moment in terms of the undermining maybe of democratic processes. It sounds like there might be some tendencies within this administration. Is that a fair assessment, or is that overstating it?
Not only in this administration, but in Senegalese politics, it's been a theme in the past. I mean, the fact that the country's never had a coup, and in a way, the fact that it's become a sort of poster child for West African democracy doesn't necessarily mean that we've had a free and fair political situation in the past. I mean, let's not forget that Macky Sall is only the fourth president in the country's history. He took over when the previous president, Abdoulaye Wade, also tried to change. Well, he did get a successful interpretation of the constitution to allow him to stand for a third term. He just didn't win the subsequent election. Macky Sall's also this is the first time that a sitting president has not taken part in an election. So we have those sort of tendencies among Senegalese presidents to want to hold on to power as long as they can. And as I said earlier, the trajectory of Macky Sall's rule has seen some fairly dictatorial features. And we've arrived at this situation. However, I guess we can also praise the resilience of Senegalese politics and, combination of political opposition and civil society, in that they've banded together and consistently managed to present a very, not united front, but a very strong front of resistance towards what Sall is trying to do. Maybe he did want to stand for a third term, but realised that the level of civil unrest that would provoke made it not feasible. And also the Constitutional Council has stood up and said, this is an illegitimate move, and has effectively cancelled the postponement to the election, which let's not forget was for 10 months. Why it took 10 months to have an investigation into the alleged machinations of the Constitutional Council is anyone's guess, unless we interpret it as Macky Sall playing for time.
I guess important observation there that we can't overlook the resilience of institutions in Senegal, but civil society as well, and the nature of competitive politics, which does seem to have some meaning, even if being on the opposing side sounds like in Senegal right now is not the easiest place to be. Now, you mentioned the Constitutional Council. That is, of course, Senegal's top court. They have ruled the bill that was passed on April 5th to postpone the election illegal. It seems, and you've indicated, that that's kind of pushed Sall to a point where he has openly declared when his term ends on April 2nd, he will leave. Now, a couple of questions come to mind. One, between now and April 2nd, presumably there's a lot of room for things to happen here. Two, is that the final nail in the coffin of any idea that Macky Sall wants to remain president of Senegal after April? Is that done? What might be some of the things that we need to look out for between now and April 2nd? In political terms, kind of a long time.
I think he will step down on April the 2nd and he'll no longer be president, but that doesn't mean his influence will disappear altogether because, as you say, Lamray, there's a lot of things to happen in the next few weeks. Firstly, we don't have an election date yet. Now, this is really confusing because, as I said earlier, the Senegalese presidential election has never been postponed before, so we don't have a precedent. The Constitutional Council invalidated the postponement of the election, but it didn't set a new date or assume that it had the right to do so. That apparently still seems to be the prerogative of the president, although the situation is still very confused. Now, obviously the opposition parties were calling on Macky Sall to set a new date as soon as possible, definitely before his mandate ends. And why, they were saying, why not in the next 2 or 3 weeks? We don't mind having a curtailed campaign period. We just want to move ahead. We'd accepted the conditions for the election. We'd accepted the fact that some of our candidates might be ruled out, particularly the PASTEF leader, Usman Sonko, who's still in jail, as is his deputy, Bassirou Faye, although he was still due to take part in the election. Now, Sall is saying initially that an election date is going to be decided after these 2 days of national dialogue that have been taking place yesterday and today. The problem is, though, that dialogue has been boycotted by 16 of the 19 opposition candidates, so essentially all those who are not part of the presidential camp. They particularly don't like the fact that representation has been included from the excluded candidates, in particular Karim Wade and the Senegalese Democratic Party, because the implication of that is that there's going to be some role for them in the election. Now, what this group of 16 wants is just the election to go ahead, so that necessarily means the excluded candidates don't take part. And just to muddy the waters even further, Macky Sall announced yesterday that he wants some sort of amnesty to take place. For a start, it's unclear who that amnesty is going to apply to. It should at least apply to the several hundred individuals who have been arrested, even back to 2021, for taking part in political protests. But the implication is that perhaps that should apply to Sonko and Faye as well. So that necessarily means there's going to be some sort of process to decide, because although Macky Sall might like to think it's true, he can't suddenly cancel a decision of the courts because Sonko was jailed by the courts. Whether that case is open to an amnesty for Macky Sall is open to question. But the real question is whether that means, he wants to say, okay, Sonko can take part in the election, because that inevitably means a further delay. And I think, the general feeling in the opposition is that they want to move past that and just get on with the election as soon as possible. Because they do want Macky Sall to just not only to step aside, but to sort of move away from Senegalese politics altogether. Because if he's still there on if he does step down on April the 2nd, the presidency has to pass in interim fashion to the President of the National Assembly, who is still a close ally of Macky Sall. How long Sall will retain his influence once he's stepped down is open to question. I guess it depends on how long his former allies believe that maintaining their allegiance to him is going to serve their purposes as well.
Wasn't there an order by a court, I think it was in December, that Sonko should be reinstated in the election? Am I getting that right? And my understanding is that hasn't happened and he's still in jail. But also, could you conceive of a situation where Sonko is released from jail? It sounds to me like if he runs, he'll probably win. And that would, what would be the point of this whole exercise if in the end the opposition candidate comes out of prison and wins?
Well, yes, that's a fair point to make. I think at this stage, all Macky Sall wants to do is muddy the waters, and he probably calculates that if Sonko is released and he's allowed to stand, or even if his deputy is released and allowed to campaign properly, it obviously increases their chances. But it also increases the chances of infighting within the opposition, because, as you probably have some flavour of, the Senegalese politics as a whole, because the ruling BBY is still a coalition and has been right back to 2012, as well as the opposition, is sort of highly fragmented and factionalized. So throwing Sonko into the equation, or at least boosting the chances of Pastef, if we can still call them Faye as being their candidate when they're officially banned, is just going to sort of complicate matters much further. So that's probably one calculation. But there are all sorts of legal complications to this. I mean, you mentioned the sort of repeated court cases to decide Sonko's candidacy. I think there were a whole series of them, different levels of court saying, yes, he can stand, and then that was annulled by the next court, and so on and so forth. But, to allow him to not only be released, but to stand would require further court decisions, because, as I understand it, he's invalidated not once but twice, because he's in jail on charges of corrupting a minor. But there is also a defamation judgment against him, which, because defamation is a criminal and not a civil offence in Senegal, also rules you out of the voter roll, and therefore you're unable to stand as a candidate for any sort of election.
So you used, I think, an apt term here, muddy waters. The more I'm hearing, the more complicated this actually sounds. So on the surface, you have the situation where, okay, Sall won't be around after April 2nd, but it sounds to me like everything else remains unchanged. And the potential for more crisis rather than less here is, at least to me, it sounds like it's kind of high, especially as long as we don't have an election date. Would you say that's a fair comment here?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, there's a potential for all sorts of things to happen just because we don't have the election date. It's perfectly possible, I guess, that after the conclusion of the dialogue today, even though that will have been boycotted by most of the opposition candidates, that the president will just name a date. And if it's in the next few weeks, then that's going to act as a very sort of pacifying influence, and we can move ahead and sort of, to a certain degree, forget all this happened. However, if we continue to get delays, and I've suggested that there are multiple ways in which that might happen, once we get towards the middle of the year, then we start running out of time, because due to Senegal's climate, a very rainy season in between approximately sort of July and October, it's going to be impossible to campaign, because it won't be possible to travel around the country very easily. Especially on some of the poor roads in the interior. We also have the complicating factor that Ramadan is about to start. That's going to be roughly, I think, March the 10th to April the 9th. And it's clearly not ideal to expect people to stand in queues all day or for several hours in the heat. Maybe in this particular situation, people will be prepared to do that, but it's clearly not an ideal way in which to hold an election.
And it might figuratively also raise the temperature if we still have an unresolved, big questions around the election and people are fasting. Not to overstate the point, but it's not conducive to have political deadlock like this. And I've just done a quick search. That tells me 97% of Senegal's population is Muslim, so virtually everyone will be fasting. Now, let's speculate a little bit, if we can. Let's say we get an election date within the next week, and let's say that election takes place latest by the summer, June, July, or something like that. One scenario. How would you see that kind of scenario playing out? Is that going to be able to put a lid on this? Do you see that that will, in a way, kind of be the pressure valve that really, lets things calm down? The second scenario, we don't get an election date in the next month or so. There are efforts to push the election until late this year. We're left in this limbo. Under both of those scenarios, how might we anticipate that things will develop in the coming 6 months or so in Senegal?
Well, obviously the best route forward is if we do get an election in the next few weeks. I mean, it doesn't necessarily need to happen by April the 2nd, but as long as a new date is set by then, we can move ahead. We can have that election. Clearly, there will be a runoff, so the second round will be held 3 weeks later. But Senegalese elections tend to be reasonably well run in the sense that the results sort of reflect the will of the people. So we will get an outcome. I guess the only concerning situation would be if it is extremely tight, and then you could argue that there are all sorts of instances in which sort of a little bit of manipulation happened here and there. That's going to sort of further complicate matters. But I mean, that's not the most likely scenario. We will get an outcome. We'll get a new president. There's still going to be a lot of horse trading involved, because let's not forget, although they lost a lot of support in the July 2022 legislative elections, BBY still has a majority in the National Assembly, wafer thin though it is, 1 seat. So that's going to delay matters as well, because whoever takes over is going to need to have a working majority in the National Assembly to be able to rule effectively. Although there are all sorts of ways in which presidential power can be asserted. However, if we do get delays, I think it's all the more worrying if this rumbles on, because we now don't have a situation in which it is expected, even though people might not like it, that the election is going to be in December. People now expect it to be much earlier, but they're becoming more and more annoyed that a new date is not being set. So I guess the most we can say for sure is there's going to be further rounds of civil unrest. There are going to be lots of flashpoints along the way. Particular dates, people expect something to happen, or big protests are being organised. And it will continue, because we don't just have the opposition political parties. We've got Senegal's well-established, very effective, very well organised civil society groups such as F24, Y'en a marre, a lot of whom have coalesced into the Protect Our Election grouping of around 40, I think, civil society groups, unions, political parties.
Assuming that we do have an election in the next couple of months, who is the most likely to win that?
It's even more difficult to say, because we don't know who's going to take part in it necessarily. I think if it is in the next couple of months, we do have to say that Sonko's not going to take part. And he'd implicitly recognised that wasn't going to happen, despite, as you say, he did have favourable judgments to some courts. He sort of anointed his deputy and said, he's a great guy, please go ahead. If you wanted to vote for me, vote for him instead. I'd say it's probably between him and Khalifa Sall, the former mayor of Dakar. As I said, he was this is a presumed prominent candidate for 2019 until his campaign was interrupted by a prison sentence.
What party does he run, Sall?
Well, he's effectively running for himself, because this is another part of Senegal fraught political situation, and his background is in the Socialist Party, but
no relation to the president, right?
No relation to the president. The Socialist Party is still part of BBY, although its influence has faded dramatically. And he's officially, I think a few years ago, he was officially kicked out of the party. That's his background, though, and he obviously retains a network and alliances from those days. And he's been campaigning around the country for many, many months now, so he is well known. This was basically the same way in which Macky Sall came to power in 2012. Behind the scenes, he was working to establish a national reputation, getting himself known in far-flung parts of Senegal. So it's difficult to know, as I said, because the political situation is so fragmented. There are no reliable opinion polls, and we've had so many sort of left field developments taking place. It's possible, I guess, that the Prime Minister Amadou Ba might make it into a runoff, but I would say his chances are fading fast.
Right. One final question, and this is to your bread and butter, country risk. All of this complication, all of these muddy waters, all of this political uncertainty can't be good in terms of how Senegal is perceived externally. Has this worsened the risk profile of Senegal? Could it do? Has it done any meaningful damage to Senegal's sort of perception internationally, its standing internationally? Could it do more damage, or is this kind of a part and parcel of the complexity that comes with Senegalese politics to some extent?
It's done a lot of reputational damage. I think we can see some taste of that in the reactions of members of the international community to the postponement. You know, the United States was particularly condemnatory, calling that move illegitimate, and the EU said something very similar. I know from speaking with many of our clients that they've been very disturbed by what's happened over the last couple of years, because the level of violence that was kicked off in March 2021 with the rioting and looting that followed the arrest of Usman Sonko has been followed by not frequent but similar episodes of violence, and that's been shocking to companies and investors who've been based and had an interest in Senegal for many years. They've been extremely concerned by what's been happening in the last few weeks, wanting to know whether they should pull their staff out. And I think it's also focused on the fact that, as we've discussed earlier, Senegal does have this reputation as a bastion of democracy, but that jars with the picture everyone's been seeing over the last couple of years. In particular, I think the level of violence displayed by the police. They've targeted civil society leaders. They've targeted political leaders, not just through these legal cases. That's not the sort of thing people expected to see in Senegal. And while it's true to say that some of that negative impression can be removed by proceeding to a relatively peaceful election with an accepted outcome, some of that negative impression is going to linger.
And I guess that will also depend to a large extent of how this crisis is resolved and when it is resolved and the nature of how that goes. It's interesting, the observation you make about the levels of violence. Is there perhaps an indication that something has materially changed in the last couple of years in terms of the politics? Because protests are nothing new to Senegal, but perhaps the severity of what we're seeing is new.
Severity in terms of the violence, I think, displayed by police towards protesters, and yes, it's been particularly important because there've been a lot of protests, because there's been a lot to protest about, but the people who are participating would see this as their legitimate right. But I think as we've been discussing, or participate. I don't think for any
Martin,
more than that.
Your audio glitched out there for a few seconds. Would you mind just repeating that last point? After people would see this as their legitimate right to protest.
Okay. Yeah, the participants would see it as their legitimate right to protest, and yet several hundred of them, if not more, have been arrested, and in many cases they've been in custody without being charged for quite some time. So, yeah, I mean, that development is concerning. The willingness of the security forces to sort of break up protests and to try and disperse them as soon as possible using tear gas and, in many cases, lethal force.
Yeah. And of course, none of this looks very good in the broader context of West Africa. We don't have the time to go into that, but we all know that ECOWAS and West Africa are having troubles at the moment in terms of the stability of governments and the stability of the region in general. We all know about the coups that have been taking place, and Senegal, in many ways, was a kind of a bastion, right, against that. So it's disconcerting regionally, I imagine, as well. But we'll have to we'll have to say.
As a final point on that, I'd say yes, it is very worrying because if people see what's happening in Senegal, they just think, well, what hope is there for the region if even the sort of most democratic country, if we can say that, is suffering these problems and is subject to the whims of a dictatorial president?
Yeah, the optics are certainly not good. Never mind the realities of a potential breakdown in the rule of law in a country like Senegal. Well, look, lots of questions that remain to be answered, but such is the nature of politics. It will be very interesting to see what happens in the next month or so. I mean, we're just a month away from when Sall now, according to his own declaration, will have to stand down. But as we've discussed, it seems like there's, if not necessarily a long road, certainly a bit of a complicated and bumpy road to travel here before we can make any calls on where Senegal is and where it's going.
Yes, it could be short, it could be long. We'll see in the next few days.
All right. Well, depending on what happens, we might have to get you back on, Martin, on the podcast to get an update. Big story for Africa this year, and it'll be a story that'll be around for some months, if not years. I think, regardless of what happens. But anyway, for now, Martin, thanks so much for taking the time. It's been a pleasure having you on. As I said, don't be surprised if you hear from us again.
Sure, it's been a pleasure speaking to you.
All right. Thank you, Martin. Take care.
Thanks.